Peace be with you all. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this evening's webinar entitled The Ongoing Naksa 55 Years On, which will involve our speakers delving into the 55th anniversary of the Naksa, which also marks the beginning of the world's longest ever illegal military occupation. Today's event is an online panel discussion where we will be hearing from Tilfie Haddad, Nardine Kiswani, Kamil Hawash, and Omar Mufid. Before I introduce our speakers, though, I'll give a very brief introduction on the Naksa for our viewers. So the word Naksa literally translates to setback in Arabic. And this marks the 1967 war of aggression, whereby the Zionist regime conducted the second largest ethnic cleansing operation en masse since its inception in 1948, which is, as we know, commonly known as the Nakba. Now, of course, the ethnic cleansing is continual and ongoing, but in the period of just 6 days in 1967, it's estimated that between 300,000 to 750,000 Palestinians were uprooted from their homes, and the Zionist regime seized full control of Gaza and the West Bank. Not only all of historic Palestine was under Zionist occupation, it also seized Syrian territory, the Golan Heights, and Egyptian territory, so the Sinai Peninsula. And here, the Zionist regime was simply acting by its own playbook, as its motto is, from the Nile to the Euphrates. And the Zionists made it very clear from 1948 that they would not tolerate being limited by the borders that their imperialist masters had given them, which was 55% of the land. So they went on to seize 80% of the land in 1948, and then in 1967, all of it, as has just been stated. And the aggressiveness that the regime displays in expanding is essential for it to change the land from a military base, which their Western masters had fulfilled the Zionist dream on the basis of, because of course it was to serve as an extension for their interests in an area of strategic importance. They wanted to transfer that military base into a real country capable of surviving, and one that is normalized by the world. And the biggest shame here is that the world superpowers conspired to actualize the creation of the Zionist regime in 1948, and the rest of the world turned a blind eye. So the fact that this occupation is ongoing for all these decades does mean that this state is not normal, because the unrest has only heightened with time. But this also alludes to the extent of the world's superpowers conspiring to allow the Zionist regime to continue breathing the oxygen of normality on an international scale. So this session will dive right straight into the Naksa. Before introducing our speakers, if you do have any questions that you would like them to answer, please do leave them in the comment sections, and the speakers will hopefully answer them in the Q&A at the end. Now, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Tilfie Haddad. Dr. Tilfie is a social scientist whose focus is on the political economy of development and conflict in the Middle East, and the Israeli-Palestine conflict in particular. His PhD was transformed into his book entitled Palestine Ltd, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territory, published by IB Taurus in 2016. He is the co-author of 2 additional books and has extensively spoken and published on and about Palestine, featured in an assortment of books, prints, television, and online media, both academic and popular. Dr. Tilfie, it is an absolute honor to have you with us.
Les, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clear.
So I start. We're ready.
Great.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and it's lovely to hear it. I'll say, because these days many people don't speak about the 1967 war, actually, and actually the general political tendency is to say, oh, the 1967 war, it led to a situation where now the occupation can't end, and it's part of this sort of narrative of like, okay, first you have 48, that's irreversible, now 67, that's irreversible. And this ends up whittling away the imagination of those who tend to not really know very much about the conflict, and say, okay, it's way too impractical to sort of change the situation, or we've got to look for a solution elsewhere somehow. But the response to that is actually to have a very clear understanding of what happened in 1967, what happened in 1948, the nature of the Zionist regime, as well as its alliances with the imperial powers that you pointed out. So I congratulate you on doing that, because I think our movement in particular needs to strengthen its knowledge of these factors, because at the end of the day, they will irrigate and inform how we come to try and understand, bringing about true liberation and justice for the Palestinian people, and an end to the oppression, the apartheid, the occupation, and the racist Jewish supremacist state that we basically live under today. Now, I guess with that introduction, it's great to have the opportunity to speak about the 1967 war, because most of the time there's more talk. There tends to be more research and more discussion around 1948, and people forget what happened in 1967. And it also tends to, but it's also sort of cascades around a similar logic of that this was a defensive war on behalf of Israel at the time, because basically the Arab armies were about to invade or something to that effect. And I mean, we must acknowledge that there is this narrative out there that is quite strong, certainly in Western circles, and the circles that count. Okay, United States, Canada, Western Europe, and basically, which still hold on to the sort of a unipolar position in terms of, and certainly are the key influential players when it comes to what's going on in our region. And for that reason, we need to be able to address that. And when we address that, we need to have the tools and the knowledge to be able to do that. So one of the reasons why I was so happy with the introduction was also because if you actually do your research on the 1967 war, something that is not very well known is exactly the fact that it was an aggressive war. And in fact, it's much more than that. The war in 1967 was pre-planned. It was conducted with pre-knowledge of the exact status of the Arab states and the Palestinians and their military intentions or not. And it was also coordinated with the Western powers, particularly the United States. Okay, these are not, large claims that I'm making because I feel like I want to be polemic. I'm making them because actually there's a point to research, and some of the archives around 1967 have opened up, and then there is actually very good research and scholarship around it. So I would suggest our readers actually look into the writings of Norman Finkelstein, who has an excellent article, or it's actually a chapter in his book, Image and Reality, in Israel, Palestine. I can't remember what the title is, but you'll find it, which debunks the myth of, it's a good broad narrative around 1967. Also, Tom Segeb's book, Tom Segeb being one of the Israeli new historians, of course, there are problems with his book, but in general, it has a lot of juicy details in it, and he like Finkelstein concurs that Israel had plans for 1967 in the early 60s. Okay, and then finally there is something that's also less well known, is the fact that just a year before the 1967 war took place, in fact, the Israeli Mossad went to King Hassan of Morocco at the time, where there was a planned meeting in September 1965 for all the large Arab leaders, including Nasser, got together with other Arab leaders to sort of plan what their strategy would be vis-a-vis Israel in the brewing tensions that was taking place. And King Hassan, who was hated Nasser and hated anything Pan-Arabist or whatnot, and essentially a patrimonial monarchist, something that really doesn't exist in the West anymore in any real powerful sense. Although, of course, we know that there's plenty of monarchies out there that still have a lot of power, and but they do not legislate in the same way that you have in the Arab world, of course. So King Hassan basically invited in the Mossad in 1965, and and allowed them to bug the hotel where these Arab leaders were meeting, and they got all the information on it. And in fact, the Israeli press was very candid and in fact very smug about this. So I just before this talk, I looked up the article from Yedi'at Ahronot, which came out a couple of years ago on the subject, quoting former military intelligence chief Major General Shlomo Gazit, who said these recordings of the session, which were truly an extraordinary intelligence achievement, further showed us that on the one hand, the Arab states were heading towards a conflict that we must prepare for. On the other hand, their ramblings about Arab unity and having a united front against Israel didn't reflect real unanimity among them. So Gazid was head of military intelligence, as I said. Thanks to the recordings alongside other sources, quote, we knew just how unprepared they were for war. We reached the conclusion that the Egyptian armed corps was in a pitiful shape and not prepared for battle. And then it finishes the information in those recordings. Gazid says, established, quote, our feeling amongst the IDF's tops command that we were going to win a war against Egypt. Prophecies of doom and the feeling of imminent defeat were prevalent among the majority of Israel and the officials outside the defense establishment, but we were confident in our strength. So that is an unknown, largely unknown part of the history of 1967. A further important but unknown dimension of 1967 is, of course, the fact that it was coordinated with the United States. So a very important resource here on this is Sandy Tolan's article from Salon magazine from 2007, something called like Debunking Israel's David and Goliath myth. Of course, 1967 is the ultimate, well, that and 48 both promote this David and Goliath mythology, which is obviously very important for Israel. And it obviously gets tougher and tougher for them to make the argument. But actually, there was no basis to it in 48 nor in 1967. But Tolan's research, what he did is he actually went to LBJ, the Johnson administration, which was in power in 1967. And he went to their archive, and it was all open. And let me read you just one of the last paragraphs from the article. It says, on June 3rd, in 67, Secretary of State Rusk, the American Secretary of State, informed Israel of the pending visit from Egyptian Vice President Muhyiddin. So basically, the Americans had invited the Egyptians to come to the United States on the 7th of June, okay? Rusk relayed a message from from Egyptian Vice President Muhyiddin, okay? Let me make sure that I got this straight. Okay, in June 3rd, 67, Secretary of State Rusk informed Israel, so he informed Israel, Rusk, the United States Secretary of State, informed Israel of a pending visit from the Egyptians, and Rusk relayed a message from the president to Nasser, quote, in view of the urgency of the situation, Rusk wrote, we hope it will be possible for him to come without delay, Muhyiddin, okay? That same day, however, at a Pentagon meeting between Mossad Director Meir Amit and McNamara, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and was the one with his hands bloody in Vietnam, okay, at a Pentagon meeting so the same day that he said that Muhyiddin was going to come, they were meeting with the Israeli head of Mossad with McNamara, talking about the prospects for war, which seemed closer than ever. Amit, okay, the head of the Mossad, told McNamara, the head of United States Defense, bluntly that he was, quote, going to recommend that our government strike. So we are going to go and attack the Egyptians, basically. So it is a war of aggression. Amit told McNamara bluntly that this time the Americans did not object. Earlier in the article, he speaks how they were a little bit cautious about this because the Israelis were so interested in attacking Egypt because they knew they had actually no real strength at the time and were unprepared and were not interested in going to war with Israel in 1967. So this time the Americans did not object. Indeed, the CIA had grown sympathetic to Israel's war aims, in which Nasser, seen as too close to the Soviets, would be defanged. Let's not forget that America was a little bit hesitant around Israel because of the Russian connection or the Soviet connection, and only the United States support for Israel really sort of goes up post 67, after the achievements of 67 have been, from their perspective, have been proven, and Israel is clearly a reliable ally for the United States, while the European decliners have finally sort of gone and died off wherever they did, in Algeria and in World War II and whatnot. So the final quotation, listen to this quotation. When McNamara asked Amit how long a war would last, the Mossad director replied, 7 days. And so the meeting between the White House and Muhyiddin, scheduled for June 7th, never took place. By that time, it was already day 3 of the 6-day war, and Israel was already in control of Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza, and the skies over much of the Middle East. So you don't really tend to hear that history, right? When you hear about 1967, you only hear about the David and Goliath narrative. And but research has its place in our. The first place that it needs to have its place is in our movements that are fighting for justice and with our allies, and we need to make those cases very clearly. Now, the interesting thing here is, so in the introduction, Butul referenced also a very important fact, which was the fact that in the general understanding is, as far as I know, is that roughly 500,000 refugees were created in 1967 war. Okay, so why, there's a margin of how much it was, but the point is the main enemy at the time was Egypt and the Pan-Arabist movement, which was essentially trying to shed the chains of colonialism in the Arab world and come up with some kind of united Arab project that could put its resources and leverage its geostrategic position and conduct mass reforms and bring a new reality for the Arab world after it suffered, the history of its colonial situation, so to speak. And so the main enemy was Pan-Arabism and Nasserism and defanging Nasser, as I think McNamara put it, or Amit put it. But there was this very important element of about 500,000 Palestinians ethnically cleansed and are pushed off. Most of these were in the Jericho region, as well as the finger that goes off of the West Bank, which had been where 3 Palestinian villages were located. In any case, the reason I emphasize this is because basically 1967 created a contradiction for Israel. Their primary target was Pan-Arabism and Nasser. They would have liked to have been able to ethnically cleanse the rest of the West Bank in Gaza, but they didn't have time. And the war needed to end sort of clean and neat as far as they were concerned. So it looked like they just took out Nasser and they did this defensive thing. Okay, and that was the narrative that they were pushing. But because of the historical memory of the Nakba from 1948, most Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza were able to remain put, 2/3 of the population. And this created the structural and the sort of demographic contradiction that Israel is still in today. The fact of the matter is there were more than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel, as the self-proclaimed state of the Jewish democratic state, was in a dilemma and a contradiction. If they gave this population citizenship, it would erode the Jewish character of the state. If they denied them it, it would erode the, quote, democratic character of the state. So what 67 is important to realize is, so we understand where we stand in the colonial history of the Zionist movement in Palestine and in the Arab world de facto. This primary structural contradiction is the structural contradiction which eventually basically leads to the Oslo Accords. Israel needed to find a solution to this problem because it couldn't erode the Jewish character of the state, and it didn't want to erode the democratic character of the state, which was important to know. The democratic character of the state was obviously important to try and keep the liberal facade of Israel and its Western allies on side. It couldn't be seen as a strictly South African model. But the democratic element is important also because Zionism was such a particular movement that it couldn't be seen as one set of Jews against another. It couldn't be just the Polish Jews who were going to set up, the Polish state in Palestine, Jewish state in Palestine. They needed to bring in as many Jews of the world, and Israel claims to be the place of the Jewish state of the people of the world, okay, of the Jews of the world, not the state of its citizens. So they needed to mediate intra-Jewish conflicts through democratic means. Okay, this explains Israel's internal democratic dynamic. The irony of that is that there still were Palestinians inside 1948 Palestine that survived the Nakba, and there were more Palestinians that they came to control and be in charge of after 1967. And today we are in a situation where basically demographically between the river and the sea, you have even a slight majority of Palestinians, 50-50, 51-49. It's not clear. Israel controls the statistics, so we don't exactly know. But this is the importance of understanding 67. So we know where we are today, and we understand what Oslo is trying to do. Now, here is a very important thing. So after 67, if you'll allow me, I still have some time, Batul?
Yes? Yeah, that's fine. You can go on for a bit.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
So, Israel was able to, needed to find this solution. So within 1 month of the 1967 war, Yigal Allon, who was the Minister of Defense, basically came up with the plan known as the Allon Plan, which basically said, we have to have a clear strategy for what we're going to do for these territories now that we took over them. We want the highlands, we want the water, we want anything ideologically connected to Zionism, we want anything militarily strategic, such as the Jordan Valley, an area known as the largest tank trench in the world, because if you control the mountain ridge where most Palestinian settlement, historical settlement is, you basically look eastward and see the ridge where Amman and the Jordan Valley is this massive ridge. And so any potential somebody who comes from the east, you see them, you can take them out very easily. So as a very important military, Israel was not militarily viable, or it was strategically weak pre-1967. And that's why it devised these plans, because it understood that we need to control the highland. In addition to the fact that all the historical, biblical, Zionist, ideological, mythological sites that was important for their narrative basically were located in the West Bank. They weren't located in Jaffa or in Haifa, which was where the majority of Jews were basically located on that coastal strip. So Allon's plan was basically that we need to find some form of self-governance arrangement, an autonomy plan for the concentrations of Palestinians in the major cities of the West Bank where Palestinians remained. And these became basically eventually the Area A's of the Oslo period. Originally, the plan was that Jordan would actually be, because Jordan was a historical ally of Israel, actually, having actually partitioned Palestine with the Zionist state in pre-19, you have Golda Meir having met with King Abdullah 27 times before 1947, before hostilities broke out. So it's well known that there was, of course, they had conflict over how much and where of the Zionists would be versus the Jordanians, but there was no intention of the creation of an independent Palestinian state. That's important to acknowledge. But bigger point I'm saying is, originally it was envisioned that the Jordanians would be given some form of autonomy arrangement over the major Palestinian cities in the West Bank. Jordan was kicked out of this arrangement, or removed from this arrangement after the first Intifada, in what's known as the disengagement, or fakk al-irtibat, as they say in Arabic. So Jordan was no longer claiming to do that. And then the PLO and its particular historical weakness, because of after the 1990-91 Gulf War, basically accepted to take on this role. Okay, and that's where we got to today in the Oslo Accords. And this was also something long and pre-planned. Okay, was not a genuine peace process. This is the important part of 1967. So the fact that Israel wanted to do this, okay, but its longer-term strategic vision would not be fulfilled even with this, okay? With this demographic balance, okay, 50-50, and a higher Palestinian birth rate, Israel was constantly in danger, quote unquote, of losing its Jewish majority. And that still is the situation today, okay? As I said, it's 50-50, and Palestinian birth rate is still higher, immigration. We don't know what's going to happen to the Israelis or whatnot, and Jewish immigration into Palestine. But the point here is to say that more and more organizations today have described the occupation sort of transforming into a situation of apartheid. Of course, between you and me, we know that the situation of apartheid has long been existing because Zionism never accepted Palestinians as equals. When they first came into the movement, they created Hebrew labor, Hebrew institutions, all this sort of business. But the point is, the apartheid. Finally, human rights organizations, after witnessing the sort of the atrocities of what's going on in the occupation and the very fact that settlers in one part of the West Bank who commit a crime will be in an Israeli court, a civil court, while a Palestinian will be in a military court. The existence of dual judicial systems and all the large criteria of which fulfills the apartheid classification, which we see today, which Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, everybody with a brain has to acknowledge, basically. The apartheid situation is a temporary situation that Israel was forced to sort of accept within the existing contradictions at the moment. Their longer term plan is to kick the Palestinians out because you do have longer term problems if Palestinians stick around, demographically become significant enough to make it look like Jews are a minority between the river and the sea, and therefore Israel has longer term plans to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from the 1967 towards at least the West Bank areas. Okay, so this is the importance of what I'm trying to say. These are active plans. This is what is behind the settlement impetus to permanently incorporate these areas of the West Bank, to surround, to fragment Palestinian areas, and to create Jewish continuity, all this stuff. Everyone's seen the maps and whatnot. And so for me, it's just important to impart that what we see today in terms, we shouldn't be arguing that the problem is occupation or not occupation, or apartheid or not apartheid. We should be focusing on the Zionist colonial strategies and what empowers it, and the fact that the United States and the Western powers, largely, okay, there are differences of opinion about certain things, are still behind this project and support why don't they take the same stance around Israel in OPT that they do with Ukraine and Russia? Okay, they could do that. They could mobilize. They could be talking about refugees have to return, get rid of the occupation, stop these war crimes, sanction. They could do all of it. We saw in 5 minutes how fast they came out with all that stuff, right? But now, 55 years later, just about an occupation, not talking about the ethnic cleansing of 48, they can barely come out with the statement. Even their own policies would say, okay, Israel should stop settlements. They can't even enforce. Okay, why? Because fundamentally they have these long-term joint interests. They're willing to allow the Israelis to actually go for it. Now, it's not, American policy is not one thing. There's a scope of opinion. We can't think just in terms of like, okay, this is it. We need to study and understand things in their specificity, no doubt. And there is actually a debate within the Americans and within the Israelis actually about how best to hold on to and protect Israel. The whole two-state solution idea, and even the Olympiad was also about like, is it strategically wise for us to hold on to this population or not? So we're in a fudge situation, okay? Anyway, it's actually their problem. It's their contradiction, okay? We need to know that. We need to internalize some of these lessons into our movement, focus on the big picture and exposing all about it, the apartheid, the occupation, the ethnic cleansing, and linking it up to and appealing to issues of justice while informing ourselves and others about it, because that's the basis of what we can, of our movement, to appeal to people of conscience that this is not in their interest. The support of occupation, the support of Zionism is not in their interest to have Western tax dollars to go to that. It's only a select few people and the elites on top who are benefiting from that thing. And there's enough problems and crap in the world, in Western Europe, in America. I mean, I'm sorry to put all the emphasis on there, but that's actually where the power is right now. So we actually have to be pretty frank about it, and we need to be strategic about how we go about with our movement and our resources. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Tilfie. That was very comprehensive. And of course, what you say corroborates the fact that there's no discussion of even a Palestinian state under the Zionist rulebook. I mean, they themselves have debunked the so-called two-state solution, just looking at the deal of the century that they put forward, in which they demanded that Jerusalem be recognized as Israel's capital, the legalization of the settlements expansion, outlining the additional annexations via 15 illegal Israeli settlements. So that's something that they themselves don't actually hold themselves to account for. So thanks for that, Tawfiq. That was very, very informative, and I'm sure our audience has benefited from that as well. So up next, we have Nardine Kiswani. She is a Palestinian organizer from New York City. She is the founder and chair of Within Our Lifetime, United for Palestine, which is a community organization revitalizing the revolutionary spirit of the Palestinians in exile in pursuit of liberation. Through WOL, Nadine has spoken for the Palestinian cause at events nationwide and worldwide, building solidarity with oppressed nationalities fighting for liberation. Nadine recently graduated from the CUNY School of Law and has organized successful campaigns on and off campus, from rallies with tens of thousands of attendees to most recently leading efforts to pass a resolution by the student government and faculty of CUNY Law to cut all ties and divest from all Israeli institutions and organizations and all corporations that serve the occupation. The resolution also defends the right for Palestinians to resist and calls to protect Palestinian speech CUNY-wide. In 2021, Nadine led a campaign that successfully defeated a proposal to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, in which it equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. While her organization led to Zionist organizations orchestrating character assassination campaigns against Nardine, demanding that she gets expelled, in the summer of 2021, CUNY Law issued a statement defending Palestinian activism and denouncing anti-Palestinian hatred. Contrary to the Zionist demands to discipline Nardine, she was chosen to be the commencement speaker at her graduation, marking another victory for those fighting for Palestine and our refusal to be silenced. I don't know where to start, Nadine. That's very overwhelming. Your achievements, mashallah, on the ground. It's an absolute honor to have you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. It's definitely a tough act to follow after Tawfiq's amazing talk, but I'm also really excited to hear from everyone else. And I think, having all of this together in this space really helps contextualize what I'm going to say as well, with, all of the history and archives and amazing information that Tawfiq shared with us. So there are some of the same things that I'm going to touch on. Of course, we're all talking about Naksa, but I think, having that context as background, I can, it'll just kind of put everything together. So, of course, Naksa means the setback, and it took place from June 5th to 10th in 1967, in which the Zionist entity expanded its occupation of Palestine, including the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. And in just 6 days between the 5th and the 10th, over 400,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, close to 500,000, maybe as Tawfiq mentioned, from their land, and they were made refugees. Israel invaded first Egypt and later Jordan and Syria. And 6 days later, the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian armies were destroyed, and they had seized the Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, and Golan. Like Tawfiq said, this is often portrayed as a David and Goliath story of a coalition of Arab states ganging up on a lone Jewish, state in the region. But the Zionist state vastly outgunned the opposing forces due to weapon support from the U.S., as well as the shaky post-colonial situation in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were in at the time. And as more Palestinians expelled from their homes and became refugees, Israel occupied now new territory over more than 1 million Palestinians. The Arab defeat in 1967 led to the growth of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was founded in 1964. But it grew much more after that, because people really, especially Palestinians, started to just build up on the notion that we can only liberate Palestine ourselves as the Palestinian people. And the Palestinian refugees were also being, whether they went to Jordan like my family, and I'll talk about that, in a bit were kind of being prepped to try to lose their Palestinian identity, and which is what Israel wanted, is for them to kind of be absorbed, even though that never happened, into these neighboring Arab countries and just become Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese, wherever they were. So out of these Palestinian refugees, many of them were being made refugees for the second time in 20 years after having already been internally displaced during the Nakba in 1948. And now Palestinians who were displaced during the Nakba now face the grim reality that return appeared further out of reach. My family, my father was born in 1963 in Beit Iksa, Jerusalem, which our family was able to, which our family was able to return to after initially being expelled in 1948. But after 1967, when he was just 4 years old, his family had to leave Palestine once again. And although he went back often to visit, despite the fact that he was born there, he could not attain a Palestinian Hawiyya or citizenship. And his village was under the control of Jordan, and they also moved to Jordan. So his citizenship became Jordanian. And despite the fact that they continued to be treated as second-class citizens and were still considered refugees, this was a way to try to make them forget about, their Palestinian identity, and it never worked. But this is also part of why many people who live an hour away in Jordan, Palestinians, most of them, are not able to go back. This is why I can't go back, despite being an American citizen and a Jordanian citizen. I can't use either passport to be able to return to my homeland in Palestine. Although I was able to visit a few times simply because of the privilege of American citizenship, it's not something that's guaranteed. And, oftentimes as soon as Palestinians become vocal and speak up against the Zionist state, they are denied from even entering Palestine because, of course, we don't control the borders whatsoever as Palestinians. It's controlled by the Zionist entity. I also think the point about Pan-Arabism is extremely important because the defeat of the Arab armies by Israel marked a setback not just for the Palestinian struggle, but for Pan-Arabism as a whole. And the defeat of Egypt led to the loss of the power they once had around uniting the Arab masses against settler colonialism and Western imperialism. Egypt, who was leading Pan-Arabism at the time, eventually became the first Arab nation that negotiated normalization with Israel just over 10 years later, in 78. I think it's also important to talk about the Arab Summit and the role that played in September 1967. The Arab Summit was a gathering of Arab heads of state in protest of their betrayal of the Palestinian struggle. The summit issued a Khartoum statement in which the Arab member states pledged to secure the withdrawal of the Zionist entity from the territories occupied during al-Naksa. The Khartoum statement also included 3 no's: no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. But of course, we know that as we continue to see the trend of normalization grow, many Arab nations did not follow this pledge. Like we said, the 1967 war had led to the occupation of Egypt's Sinai. And in 73, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and regained control. But under Sadat in 1978, they were given back the Sinai, technically, after they shamefully signed a peace treaty with Zionists. However, as we've seen with the disastrous effects of U.S. aid and the disastrous effects that Zionism has on all Arabs, on all people living in the Middle East, Egypt had lost so much more than they supposedly regained by getting back this territory, through this normalization deal. Now we see the trend of normalization in corrupt Arab regimes grow. And as Tawfiq mentioned, the connection to Oslo as well. One of the other original normalizers, which we often overlook, is the PLO itself. And this is part of how many Arab nations justify their shameful normalization today. But of course, so much of this scheme that was set forward that led to normalization, that led to these peace treaties, was initiated, or you could point back to this time specifically. Of course, all of the history and all of the Nakba and everything we face lead to that, but you really can trace these trends specifically. And as anti-Zionists, it's not just the 1967 occupation that we seek to oppose and dismantle, but the entire occupation of historic Palestine from the river to the sea. It's in the post-1967 spirit of recentering the struggle for Palestinian national liberation and the right of Palestinian refugees in exile to return to all of historic Palestine that we commemorate the Naksa and celebrate the ongoing resistance to Zionism within historic Palestine and throughout the diaspora. This is why we say, at our rallies when we're chanting, we don't want 2 states, we want 48, we want all of it. Another important point that has become recently repopularized, a repopularized narrative, but I've always heard this growing up, and it's of course something that you can look into, and this is true. Although people say this sounds just absolutely crazy when you say it. In 1967, immediately following the Six-Day War, the state of Israel banned the Palestinian flag in the occupied Gaza and the West Bank. And in 1980, there was a law forbidding the artwork of political significance, which any artwork composed of the 4 colors of the Palestinian flag was subject to this, and Palestinian artists were arrested for displaying such artwork. And this is why the watermelon became a symbol of resistance, because it had those 4 colors, of course, green, red, black, and white, inherently in its fruit. And it just, turns this whole thing on its head and shows how ridiculous, the Zionist entity is, and how the Palestinian flag continues to be criminalized today. Just last month, Shireen Abu Akleh's funeral procession and Walid al-Sharif's funeral procession, both murdered in cold blood by the IOF, were attacked for raising the Palestinian flag. They literally busted the back of the hearse, or the car that they were using to transport her casket, to get the Palestinian flag from behind it. I remember the last time that I went to Palestine, I also hid a Palestinian flag in my bag, and I wore it at one point around my neck while I was, walking on the grounds of Al-Aqsa, because I felt very secure too as an American citizen, that although we've seen the brutality that they've subjected even American citizens to, I thought, that as a woman and as an American citizen, that I could have more, protection doing this. But as I was walking out, they searched my bag because I had taken it off, but they had seen it already. And they took it away from me. And then they told me that I was not allowed to return into the grounds of Al-Aqsa to pray inside, even though my whole family was inside. And they told me that if I'm going to act like a man, then I have to stay outside and pray with the men. And it was even so difficult to sort Palestinian flag to begin with. I went to every single store in the old city, and everywhere I asked, they would say that they wouldn't have it, or they told me that I would get in trouble for asking that, or that they could get in trouble if they sold it to me, until I was able to find someone who, trusted me from meeting me that first time, and had some Palestinian flags in the back that he hides, that he's not able to openly sell because they're criminalized by the Zionist entity. And on Sunday, May 29th, we saw heroic Palestinian resistance in the wake of the Zionist provocative flag march, where a Palestinian flag was flown on a drone over Bab al-Amud, flying higher than our oppressors' flag. So I just wanted to mention this point, because not many people know that it was banned. The Palestinian was banned immediately following the Six-Day War. So I know I did not speak for long at all. I think if there are Q&As, I would like to speak more during that time, and I'm really excited to hear from the rest of the speakers about the Six-Day War and learn from you all. Thank you.
And of course, what you emphasized there about Palestinians not accepting being absorbed. I think a crucial case study of this was last year's Intifada of Hope and Unity, which proved the united front of the Palestinians. You had those within 48 that began mobilizing, and they formed a local front from the inside of the regime, which actually became an uncalculated source of fear for the Zionists, because of course there are those who like to spread, lies and propaganda that the Palestinians within the 48 borders are asleep, or they have no psychology to rise up and to resist or to protect the Palestinians that are actually within what is considered the occupied territories. And I think that probably played a part in the fact that the war only lasted for 11 days as opposed to the other wars that were longer. So it was much shorter than previous aggressions. But absolutely, thank you so much for that holistic presentation, Nordine. Up next, we have Professor Kamel Hawash. He is a British Palestinian academic and writer. He is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, abbreviated to PSC, and a founding member of the British Palestinian Policy Council. It's a pleasure and honor to have you, Professor Kamel.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Before I forget, let me congratulate Nadine on her speech in person. I did, Nadine, congratulated on social media, but it's a great opportunity to be on the same panel as her. I'm probably the only one who was around in 1967. I was born before that. So I'll just start with an anecdote about that. So I remember I was born in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh. And I remember at the age of 5, so this is 1967, my mother was crying in her bedroom. And I went up to her and asked her why she was crying. And literally, this is an English translation of what I thought she said. And I'm sure those pro-Israelis watching this will try and use this. But what I remember saying is, when I asked her why she was crying, was the Jews have occupied your grandmother. Now, of course, I'm sure she didn't say that, but that's what I remember. My grandmother lived, my grandparents were in Jericho, even though we are, as he was, from Jerusalem. But so that was what I heard, that there had been an occupation that had extended to where my grandmother used to live. And Nordine mentioning the flag was really important for me, because before 1967, I had not from memory seen a Palestinian flag. I didn't know anything about Palestine. But what happened was that my mother, with some friends, started fundraising to help Palestinian refugees at that time. And because she was a dressmaker, she actually started sewing something. And I didn't realize initially that was the Palestinian flag. So she actually was somebody who sewed it in 1967, and they had fundraising events. The next thing I remember related to 1967 is being in Assault in Jordan a year before 1960. So in 1968, I believe, visiting one of my aunts, and the Jordanians were having simulated bombing raids to prepare the population, because of course 67 was only a year before that. But what I wanted to get to was the first time I actually visited Palestine, and I can remember, was in 1969, so 2 years after the occupation. And of course, my mother, whose family and my father's family both lived inside, had to get a tasrih, a permission, invitation to go and visit. So we went in 1969, we went to Jericho, and comparing it to what it's like now, there is no comparison. So in Jericho, in the parts of Jerusalem where my family lived, there were virtually no Jewish Israelis. And the sort of moving around between Jericho and East Jerusalem, and even into inside the Green Line, was no issue. So I used to just get on a bus in Jericho and arrive at my other gran who lived in Jerusalem. But these are my actual memories, if you like, of the 1967 occupation. And then, of course, we began to understand more what it all meant. I'd heard of Fatah, I'd heard of the PLO. My lasting memory from being in Saudi Arabia is that 5% of my father's salary went to the PLO. All Palestinians who lived in the Gulf states had that amount deducted to help fund the PLO. So I think, Tawfiq set out the historical aspects, and I wasn't going to do that anyway, but I thank him for that. now, the whole point about the meeting today, I think, and what we've just experienced is not just the Naksa, it is the continuing Nakba, that from the initiation, the absolute forced introduction of a state onto the Palestinian homeland, until now, the indigenous population of Palestine still has been denied its rights for 74 years and more, because of course before that the British, I sit here in Birmingham in the UK, so I'm very well aware of the role of Britain and what happened in the Mandate and so on, that you can trace our predicament back to 1948, even though Israel tries to present the situation now as it is this democratic, high-tech, peaceful state that protects religious freedom, if it wasn't for rockets flying out of Gaza. So they basically shifted the initial starting point for everything that happens now. So any young person in the West and others who weren't very aware of the Palestinian injustice, as I call it, I don't call it a conflict, think that actually, oh yeah, we have an ally, Israel, and it does its best in this horrible region to survive. The reason it has such an expenditure on the military is because of what it faces, and therefore we must stand with it. And of course, then they hear the politicians. You will remember last year, for example, in Sheikh Jarrah, where in fact one of the families, one of the 28 families is one that belongs to my late cousin, where they were going to be evicted, ethnically cleansed, because they were definitely not going to be replaced with other Palestinians. It was going to be a replacement with Jewish Israeli settlers. That the world was silent, even when they attacked Bab al-Amud, when they attacked the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It was only when the first rocket came out of Gaza that the Western world came out and said, we stand with Israel's right to defend itself. Well, an occupying state defending itself from the people who are trying to end the occupation. And again, I'm not commenting on the rockets, and people can call the groups, whatever they wish. But the point is that Israel was continuing its policy, which is part of what Tawfiq really mentioned, which is to push Palestinians out of the areas that they want. And then at some point, and I always say, unfortunately, if Israel put Palestinians on buses to Jordan, who would stop it? This is where it ultimately could lead. So just go back and say that a lot of what happened in 1948 and 67 continues and is more accentuated by the fact that Israel feels completely free to do whatever it likes. Over the last week, maybe nearly 10 Palestinians have been killed in cold blood. No reason for killing them, but it seems a shoot to kill policy, even if it isn't written down and advertised. This is what happens. A single woman approaches a checkpoint and gets killed. It's absolutely, it's very difficult to understand the brutality. But then this new trend of not only attacking the living, but attacking the dead, the funerals. Now, almost every funeral where there's any contact with the Israelis, the funeral procession is attacked, and people struggle to even bury the dead. Of course, in 1947, the international community itself approved the division of Palestine. The UK celebrated Balfour. Balfour was mentioned, and there's no doubt that at best, what the British institution says, and I mean that rather than a government, because it's the institution that survives in between governments, is the only problem with Balfour is we haven't succeeded in bringing the second part in, which, if you remember, was about really the civil and religious rights of the communities that were not Jewish, rather than the political rights. So there's no real a commitment to a Palestinian state, even though when you ask the UK's government, it says our commitment is a two-state solution, etc., etc. In reality, they've actually almost stopped talking about it. They've almost stopped condemning even settlement growth. The UK government here has really made its position known as one of supporting Israel. And unfortunately, I have to say, whatever it does, there's never sufficient condemnation. On the contrary, it's about growing trade and ensuring that this ally continues to thrive. We know that in 2018, when the new Jewish state law came into existence, that was a clear demonstration to the world that Israel does not treat its own citizens who are not Jewish, let alone the Palestinians it occupies, equally, when it gave the right to self-determination only to Jewish Israelis in Israel whose borders are not defined. In other words, it could be anywhere, but a Jewish person or the Jewish people, as they would be described in that, have a right to self-determination, but nobody else does who lives on that land. And I remember the Druze getting upset because they were not somehow included. Well, now you understand, the Druze people, that the domination by Jewish Israelis through the policies, through the laws, is as clear as they can make it, that only they have a right to self-determination on the land. So that was a point at which the Western powers might have said, oh, wait a minute, you can't do that. The right of self-determination belongs to all people. And they didn't. They watched the killings at the Gaza border and again said that Israel has a right to self-defense rather than standing with even the medics and the journalists. And as you know, Shireen Abu Aql, unfortunately, was not the first journalist to be murdered. There were a number murdered at the fence. And again, I object to people calling the fence between Gaza and the other side, where the refugees want to go to a border. It's not a border. Even Israel doesn't say it's a border. Its borders are fluid. But the point is that even the killing of people at the fence who came to peacefully protest, and they wanted to return, as one of the patrons of PSC says, Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, they were not asking for the right to return. They were returning. They wanted to actually cross and get to it. But where we are now, and that's where I want to get to, because maybe we ought start thinking about where things are heading, is that there is no doubt that between the river and the sea, there's only one state. There's no doubt that there's discrimination in each area of that state. We know about the different color cards the Palestinians have to carry. We know about the fact that Israel wanted to fragment the Palestinians completely, and there is that fragmentation between Gaza, the Green Line, inside the Green Line, the West Bank, even East Jerusalem, where people just do not know quite where they belong because they're actually stateless. Yes, in the Palestinian Authority, they get Palestinian Authority passports, but in East Jerusalem, they've got travel documents and a supposed residency card, which isn't permanent because they can withdraw it at any time. So as far now as this current government is, the impunity it has allows it, and the mentality of the settlers who are leading this government, to do whatever they want. And this is where I get really worried about the next steps in terms of the force with which they will keep hitting Palestinians, because what they would like is for the Palestinians to leave of their own accord. The issue about the word temporary occupation. Since 1967, really? 55 years is a temporary occupation? It's become permanent. The siege on Gaza, in my view, is becoming permanent, even though it isn't 55 years, but that seems to be being entrenched completely. When you look at Israel's other policies, it is all about saying nothing is temporary. We are in charge. They certainly have security sovereignty. They believe they can go anywhere and get anyone they want. But having been emboldened by the Trump administration to extend sovereignty de facto, even if it isn't de jure, that's what they've been doing. And they have made the two-state solution, which they never really wanted to see, impossible to achieve, and anyone who visits can see that. I unfortunately can't visit now because in 2017 I was denied entry because of my work with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and particularly working again to support the BDS movement. Because one of the things looking forward that we Palestinians all ask is, what do we do? What can we do? What does the world, if we say allow us, and I'll put in the quotation marks because we shouldn't be allowed to do, we want to reclaim our land back. But what do they think we should do? They said military resistance is terrorism. Israel then says going to the International Criminal Court is legal terrorism. BDS is economic terrorism. So breathing perhaps now is terrorism because it allows us to continue to live. One of the things about the demographic issue, although they haven't called babies being born terrorism, they are a demographic threat. And I always say to the Palestinians, have more babies. That is something at the moment, they can't stop us from doing. Let's make sure that change in the demographics comes about and we try and get out of it. In terms of going forward, our job, all of us, wherever we are, has to continue to be, particularly outside Palestine, of course, is to keep the pressure on governments in all the positions we are in, whether it's America, Canada, or in the UK. But the other thing we need, and I'll mention something about the PLO because I think it's important to mention, the PLO is our umbrella as Palestinians everywhere. And that is what we need to reclaim from those who have taken it away from us. And I mean by that, of course, and here I speak as an ordinary Palestinian, not as chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, but the people have taken the PLO away from us. They've turned it into effectively whatever the current leadership wants it to be. So I'm involved in an initiative which is called the National Campaign for Rebuilding the PLO, where we are working to try and place pressure on the current leadership for elections to the Palestine National Council, which is our basically democratic parliament for Palestinians everywhere, from Chile to Australia to Britain and inside Palestine as well. We need a new leadership that will take our national project forward. We need to look again at our national project in the context of being in 2021, not in the 1960s. What do we want? Because that's a question we keep being asked by people who support us. And how do we plan for its achievement? Because we do not have a strategy at the moment, and the people in our leadership seem to be incapable or under the thumb of the Israelis and the Americans and even some Arab regimes to say that basically you have to accept whatever crumbs are thrown at you. But as you saw from what Nadine said, and I'm sure Omar, when who speaks later, who are both a bit younger than me, that yes, the old died, we couldn't stop that, but the young have not forgotten. So we must continue to make sure that wherever we are working to pressure governments, to educate populations about the real story, the Palestinian narrative, rather than the narrative that the Israelis are pushing, which is that anyone who criticizes Israel is simply anti-Semitic. And oh, by the way, have you adopted the Sharia definition? The Irish definition is completely inappropriate for what it is designed for, unless you are Israel, because they want to use it to criminalize people who are speaking out against the Israeli injustice against the Palestinians. So what I will close with is what we must continue to do is, of course, commemorate the Nakba, the Naksa, but what we take away from them is that we must come together as Palestinians. I applaud every initiative that Palestinians start anywhere, whether it's on university campuses in the US or what happens inside Palestine. But we genuinely have to come together. And I believe the place to come is through the Palestine National Council, so that we can retake our own Palestine Liberation Organization, restart the strategy that we need for the way forward. Because for every day we wake up, we find that the Israelis are taking more of our land, causing real heartache and a loss of hope to Palestinians in Palestine. We need them to remain where they are, but we need to come together as one people, 14 million Palestinians, to take the fight on and reclaim our homeland. Thank you very much indeed. Are you on mute, Batul?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Kamel. And just going back to what you said at the beginning, interestingly, which has sparked some thoughts in my mind about how the Western media's point of reference is always the Palestinian acts of resistance. And it's also made me think, why these acts of resistance are being criminalized by governments in the West in particular. Although, of course, the UN not only allows armed struggle over people under occupation, but it states it as a kind of inalienable right. And that criminalization, of course, we're seeing that it comes where there is effective movement. And that's why even the BDS movement itself is going on the verge of being criminalized. And specifically on the topic of armed struggle, we have case studies on the ground for liberation. So, for example, I'm from South Lebanon. I mean, South Lebanon itself was under Israeli occupation from 1982 until 2000. But the only way in which that occupation ended was due to the resistance movement on the ground. And it's the same case in Palestine as well, in Gaza, right? How did Israel unilaterally withdraw? It was because the resistance made it unbearable for them to basically continue maintaining their occupation inwards. That led to obviously Gaza now being under siege. But ultimately they withdrew because they knew that it costs them more than to stay. So these are just general and interesting points to think about when we talk about the struggle for justice and its holistic nature. Thank you very much, Professor Kamel. Up next, and last but not least, we have Omar Mufid. He is a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and West London's PSC Executive Committee. It's an absolute pleasure and honor to have you, Omar, with us.
Thank you so much, Batul, and thank you for the speakers. To be honest, after these very rich speeches or words, I don't know what to say, but it's always good to remind everyone that Israel is a colonial state built on killing, expelling the Palestinian. And for most of us, we call the occupation 74 years for the occupation, as the occupation started in 1948. So after 1948, Israel tried to split the Palestinian. So most of the Palestinians were outside Palestine, 700,000 Palestinians were outside Palestine, and some Palestinians were inside the 1948 borders, and the rest were in Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem. So Israel tried to split these people and treat each group separately. Then in 1967, Israel tried again to split the Palestinian and to give Palestinian the national ID. And the funny fact that Israel is giving the Palestinian the national ID. So you will not be a Palestinian by the Palestinian ID, except if Israel give you this national ID number. So now we have different IDs for the people who live in Jerusalem, the 400,000 Palestinian. They don't have Israeli passport. They have special travel documents, temporary, as Dr. Kamel mentioned. They love the word temporary. So they are temporary travel documents. We have the people who are living inside 1948. They have the blue ID, which allow them to go to some areas in the West Bank, but they cannot go to Gaza. We have the Gazan Hawiya or ID, which Gazan, they cannot go to Jerusalem, to 1948, or to the West Bank. We have the West Bank ID, which not allowing people from the West Bank to go to Jerusalem, the 1948 or Gaza, except if they have special permits. So Israel tried to kind of split the Palestinian. For the people, Palestinian who live abroad, who are more than 50% of the Palestinian, it's a different story. So being a Palestinian does not give you the chance to visit Palestine or live in Palestine. Like most of the Palestinians who live abroad cannot visit Palestine. So, there is a funny story that there were a Palestinian 60 years ago. A young Palestinian was born in Libya. And when he was in his 15 years old, someone have told him, because he doesn't have the Palestinian ID, the only way to visit Palestine is to be a doctor. So he worked hard, he studied medicine, and now he is a doctor and working in the UK and he achieved his dream to visit Palestine, and he go there with medical aid for Palestine with UNICEF to help in the medical treatment for the Palestinian. So some Palestinians, they plan their trip to visit Palestine since they are very young, and they dream how they can go to Palestine. And we have to remember in here as well. So Israel was trying to divide the Palestinian for 74 years. And what we have seen in May 2021, 17th of May, we have seen a national strike where Palestinian in Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, 1948, they were all united in national strike. We have seen them for the first time in a national strike since 1936. And Israel have tried to do everything, but Palestinians inside Palestine, outside Palestine were united in this national strike. So we see the hope, although the situation is very bad in Jerusalem, in Gaza, West Bank, outside Palestine, but there is still hope. If we want to talk about the impact of 1967, which we call it Naksa, there's a huge impact. So Gaza and West Bank, as the first speaker, Dr. Tawfiq, was speaking, was under the Egyptian and the Jordanian control. But now, until now, Gaza and West Bank are under the military law. So the Israeli government choose a person from the Israeli army, and they call him or her the Munassiq for Gaza, the coordinator for Gaza. And this person make the decisions to open the borders, to close the border, to allow people to travel, to allow this. So for example, if you want to import anything or export anything, if you want to open a manufacturer, if you want to open a hospital, you speak with the Israeli Munassiq. So if you are in Gaza and want to make a manufacture, or in the West Bank, if you want to export something, you need to speak with the Munassiq and get the permission from them, ask them what is allowed, what is not allowed. And now the Munassiq is using the social media. So now they have Facebook pages, they have a mobile application. So they try to humiliate the Palestinian. They want the Palestinian to be in contact with the Israeli army and to get the permission from them, which is horrible. And Dr. Kamel have mentioned something about the siege in Gaza. So Israel called it a temporary. But as we know, since 2006, Gaza was in the siege. And until now, the siege is becoming harder and harder every day. So before the siege, there were more than 8 borders with Gaza. There were Al-Muntar, there was Sofa, there is Nah al-Oz, and other borders. So Israel closed all these borders and kept just 2, Beit Hanun areas and Karem Abu Salim. So to make the siege more effective. So as Dr. Kamel mentioned, Israel make one step and keep it as this is the normal life for the Palestinian. If we look at the impact of this kind of 1967 on the Palestinian in Gaza and the West Bank, the settlements which was in Gaza until 2005, always the settlements in Gaza and West Bank, they take the best land, which is usually used for the farms, for the agriculture. So Israel take the land for the settlement, then they make a security zone, then they take the roads, and they take most of the land, and then Palestinians will not be able to do the farming. And this is why the Palestinians have lost 100,000 people who were working on the farming sector, but because of the Israeli kind of restrictions, they left the profession, and now they work in other sectors. This is one way, which is taking the land by the settlements, by the separation wall, by the roads, by the security zone. Also, Israel take all the sources. Israel take the water, and they take everything. They don't allow Palestinian to take the water or anything. If we look what is the international community doing, so they are not just silent, they are complicit. So if you look at the UK, there are lots of Israeli army kind of facilities in the UK. So there is an Israeli arm manufacture company in the UK producing the arms to kill the Palestinian. So they produce it in the UK, export it to the Israeli army to kill the Palestinian. There are Israeli military labs in lots of UK universities, such as University of Bath. We've seen the UK universities have invested more than £500 million in the complicit companies, the companies that support the Israeli occupation and the settlements. And this is not by us. The United Nations have put in a blacklist of the companies, which is complicit by the companies. And we know these companies, the list, like when you see Booking.com or Airbnb putting the Israeli settlement houses, which is owned by, like the land is owned by Palestinian, and offer people to rent it through their website. They are complicit with this settlement. So, the UK government even is banning the councils from stop investing in the complicit companies. Now the British government have put in a law to stop the councils. So we are not talking about silent. We are talking about a complicit word who's helping the occupation and putting the Palestinian lives in danger. And we have seen what happened to Shireen Abu Akleh, what the international community have done. How many prime ministers or ministers of media have spoken about this? Maybe 2 or 3. However, when we see in other parts of the world, if we have seen any journalist is killed, we see lots of media coverage and officials speaking about this. Israel is also taking our food, like the hummus, they call it hummus, or I don't know what they call it. They take our hummus, they took our maftool, they take our even fatta al-Ghazdawiya and everything. So they try to take our culture, our clothes, but Palestinians are increasing. The Palestinians still have the belief that they will return to Palestine, and they will never forget this kind of Palestine. And lastly, the Palestinian struggle is part of the international anti-racist pro-solidarity movement. So the Palestinian struggle is part of the anti-apartheid movement, is part of the anti-racist movement, is part of the Black Lives Matters, is part of the lots of areas who are suffering and struggling, and Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Thank you.
Ahsant. Thank you so much, Omar, especially highlighting the Zionist regime's numerous aggressions and, of course, the role played by the world superpowers. So reiterating the root issue again, that it was not simply the case that, a gang went in and overtook Palestine in 1948. It was a worldwide conspiracy project. You've mentioned the role that Britain is playing today, in addition to the US, and you can even say the USSR back then. So there's a kind of shame on the whole world as the perpetrating entities of the Nakba are the world superpowers at large, and the Zionist regime exists, of course, due to the West's need for it. And we see how this continues today in the way that they facilitate the existence of the Zionist regime. Absolutely. We have around 12 minutes before the closure of this session, which has been very interesting so far. I have one holistic question, which I would like to ask, and of course, any of the speakers feel free to give your input to this question. So the question is that the Nakba ultimately reminds us that international law itself is erected on the ruins of the occupation and the aggression of the Palestinians, because it was international law that actually gave recognition to the Zionist regime from the start. So it was the UN that gave them 55% of the land up front, and then it turned a blind eye to the fact that the Zionists, stole 80% of the land in 1948, which then became recognized as Israel on the international scene. And so, of course, when the occupying regime decides to extend the ethnic cleansing operation onto 1967 to occupy the remaining 20% of historic Palestine, that gets deemed as illegal. So I guess the first question here is, shouldn't we be raising the question of why are the occupations of Gaza, the occupation of the West Bank, of East Jerusalem, why are those occupations in 1967 considered illegal, whilst the occupation of 80% of historic Palestine in 1948, that was considered legal, when both of those implicated ethnic cleansing? And this also leads on to the fact that the idea of using the international framework within the Palestinian struggle for justice can contradict with even the UN resolutions themselves. So the idea of how can all Palestinians be granted the right to return when 80% of historic Palestine is still under occupation, and that's recognized as legitimate under international law. The idea of who will secure the rights of the Palestinian refugees who are in exile. And that's why we see that most, if not all, the UN resolutions themselves are remaining on the shelves, and the superpowers are not acknowledging the decisions that have been put forth. So it's not only the case that they haven't been applying those resolutions, they changed those resolutions. And we've seen that with the deal of the century that was proposed by Trump and his son-in-law, which abolished the previous laws of the UN, raising a question of how top decisions reflect the balance of forces on the ground. So I guess another question to this would be, what would force the superpowers to abide by the UN resolutions that are not being acted upon? And how do we shift the balance of forces on the ground that will force the change to occur? Because that change won't come by simply demanding it and relying on international law, which is not holy and represents a compromise ultimately in the interests of the superpowers. So any thoughts on that by any of the panelists?
I can quickly go. As somebody who recently graduated from law school, you might think that my faith in these systems is very high, but unfortunately, it's not. Sometimes we just have to use as many tools that we have at our disposal, and that sometimes means referencing United Nations resolutions, although we know that they have no power and they have no intention, at least no power in terms of getting accountability for Palestinian refugees. I think part of why UNRWA was created specifically was because of the guilt that the United Nations felt from being one of the direct reasons, or being the direct reason why Palestine was divided this way. And I was also a human rights major in undergraduate, and I was in the human rights program at my school, and my teacher was actually a media correspondent at the United Nations. So I would go to the United Nations in New York City all the time to learn about these things. And really, from learning, I was also part of Model United Nations and all of that. And what you really learn isn't that this is some noble body that wants to enact peace and equality for the people of the world. It's actually a guise for imperialism, and it's neoliberalism, right? They're just using these terms like human rights to act as a pretense to invade certain countries. We know that there is no actual protection of human rights, and that imperialism is facilitated in these spaces, in spaces like the United Nations. That doesn't mean that we can't also be a part of that arena and struggle, although I don't think that that's the main arena, because at the end of the day, laws are just words on paper. They don't matter because they'll only respond to power. And that's the only thing that I've seen gain concessions for Palestinians in my time organizing and just looking at the history has been Palestinians resisting by any means necessary and gaining their land back. It was the resistance that gained land back in Gaza that got all settlements out of there. That's the only one of the only examples I can point to. Nobody ever was like, oh, we're going to give you your land back because you guys protested nicely or you asked for it nicely. Even BDS is criminalized. And what is BDS? BDS is not even saying support Palestinians. It's just saying, can you not pay for the bullets that kill our people? That's all it's saying. It's literally, people claim to be neutral. If you're neutral, you should support BDS, right? But even that's criminalized and vilified. So I think, we're not going to see concessions from the Zionist state or from the international world superpowers in support of Palestinian liberation until we demand it. And, like Kamal said in the beginning of the talk, was that when people were protesting, when Israel was attacking Palestinians all throughout the summer, nobody paid attention last year. But the second that Gaza fired a rocket, everyone started paying attention. Layla Khalid said when they were being tortured in the dungeons, nobody heard their cries. But when they hijacked an airplane to show people that they want to go back to their homeland, the whole world started paying attention to Palestine. This is why I believe that Palestinian liberation will only come through any means necessary, and that includes resistance in all of its forms. And this is why we've also been facing so much blowback. You might have noticed I've been a little tired throughout this talk, is because since I've graduated, there have been articles coming out every single day, threats, things like that, coming from politicians, media in New York City here, saying that we're anti-Semitic because we outwardly say that we believe in Palestinian resistance by any means necessary. But I think that's the idea that we have to get to people. And And necessary is the important part, because I don't define what's necessary. The enemy defines what's necessary. If the enemy makes it necessary for Palestinians to use a certain form of defense, you know, that's on them, and that's what's happened. So sorry, I want to leave space for other people. I hope that made sense.
Santi. Yes, go for it, Kamil.
It's really to bring us back to what we as Palestinians should be doing, and I'll talk about the lack of strategy. What Nardine just referred to is, you know, she's very passionate about resistance and so on. And I'm not saying that resistance does not deliver in the long term. But my point is, we just don't have a strategy. And that is our biggest problem. So you can't just have resistance of any form without it being part of a strategy that says, this is where that sits. These are the, you know, this is how it could be done. What about popular resistance? I mean, imagine if, and I've discussed it with Palestinians, if outside every settlement, every Friday, Palestinians march and just sat in the road and stop them carrying on their normal business. Yeah, now that's not violence. They'll be met with violence. But my point is, without a strategy which says, this is what Palestinians agree should be the way forward, and we all get behind it, I don't think it's sufficient, if you pardon me using that, to talk about one angle. This is what we lack. We lack a strategy. And the reason we are being denied a strategy is the current leadership just sits in Ramallah, carries out security cooperation with the Israelis. The Americans come and tell them what to do. The EU says, unless you stop teaching hate in your curricula, we won't fund you. And they're moving to sort of manage one financial crisis to another, when what should be happening is saying, look, what was their strategy to stop normalization? Okay, you might say it would have happened anyway, but was there a strategy to make sure that the Arab world was behind us? I don't think so. It was sort of relying on the Arab dimension rather than making sure it happened. So I'll stop here, but I do think we need to get back to a national strategy that all Palestinians, we can then say our part, see what part we can play outside to support what has been agreed upon, what people in Gaza must do, what people inside the Green Line. Yeah, that's what I think is missing. And it's not easy to get to, but that's what we should be arguing for, I would say.
Do you have any contributions, Tawfiq, Omar? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, Tawfiq, please.
I do. I mean, the initial question had to do with international law and the relevance of it and their implication, complicity, or sort of. You're absolutely correct. The United Nations played an important role in the destruction of Palestine by acknowledging by in many senses, primarily through the partition plan. It's important to acknowledge that the partition plan, there were only about 47 countries in the United Nations at the time, by the way. And that even to get that, they had to do a lot of different kinds of bribery. Look, international law is sort of a utopian template that's out there for a nice, ideal, sort of happy family, global community kind of thing. That's how it argues itself. In fact, and you'll find the paperwork that says that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the laws the de facto is of course what has come out in this discussion, which is that it's basically a medium and a body to the United Nations. There's the United Nations and there's international law. I mean, we don't want to say they're exact same thing, of course, but it's an arena where inter-imperial war takes place, and where they try and figure out, at least on a temporary basis, how they can not slaughter each other on the battlefield. And but everybody is using the discourse of security or rights and all this sort of stuff. So the important point, yes, is correct. On one level, I think it is important to sort of, say we want a better world and that, everybody's entitled to a whole set of rights. On the other hand, I'm not going to be a fool and say, oh, I want this, but deny the actual power reality on the ground, which is, the fact of the matter is international law doesn't mean anything unless you have an ability to defend it, and you need power. Okay, and for that reason, we need power, and we are weak, and we need to acknowledge that. And this whole discussion is about 1967. What was 1967 about? As I said in the thing, when you look at the Americans and the Israelis, it was to defang Nasser. Okay, defanging Nasser? What did that really mean? It meant take the Sinai so that Egypt is out of the game. Okay, and actually, there was quite important articles that came out in the past year about how basically once they got Sinai, they knew the Palestinians were sort of much more cornered, basically, in the sense that basically Sadat was in a position where he was like, either I'm going to, the Israelis and the Americans could sit and wait until the Arabs were ready, because to give up on, and it was very important to get Egypt out of the game, because Egypt was the largest, the strongest, the most powerful, the leading power at the time. Okay, and that's what they did, and they waited whatever they waited for, I guess, into the late 70s, another 12 years or whatever, and they got what they needed, basically. Syria didn't come to the table, but Syria didn't get their land back either. Okay, I do want to take a little bit of issue. I mean, it's an interesting debate what's going on with Nadine and Kamel. And I think it's important debate to have out. I actually don't think, and I think it's probably important to say this. I would say, okay, I think power is important, but power can mean many things. I'll start with that. Okay, there is armed resistance, and the international law entitles us to a lot of things, including right to resist. So we should not be apologetic about that in any sense. But we also have to realize it can take many forms, and we shouldn't be. Oftentimes, the power of the gun is it needs to be assessed in its context to know whether it's the appropriate tool, because it might not be the appropriate tool in everything. I'm not saying it is or isn't at this time. I just want to put that in context. On the other side, I would also say about what Kamel has said is that we don't have a strategy. I actually believe we do have a strategy. We have too many strategies. We have multiple strategies. Actually, Fatah has a strategy, and Hamas actually has a strategy, but they are not acting in unison with one another. So we have multiple strategies going on at the same time. Now, I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum to go into what each one's strategy.
That's really what I'm saying. That is
but who is the we? That's the point. The we is, in the end of the day, unless you set up an institution, an address, a party, or something, we are not united. We are fragmented. It's true, and it's natural that we have political diversity in our opinions. And ideally, you are correct. We do not have a unified. It would be ideal to have such a thing. We're not there yet. I think we shouldn't be we shouldn't throw babies out with bathwater entirely. We need to. It's much more better to understand the actual strategy of Fatah and the actual strategy of Hamas and the other strategies, which are also which exist but are probably much weaker in terms of their genuine power, and to understand what they can and can't achieve. And in that regard, I would say the important thing is that, like, I'm not sure either of them at this actually individually or right now, certainly individually, are not. They're actually both operating in defensive terms. And indeed, we need a unified strategy. We need to bring our power forward, etc. And 67 was about taking out the big Arab power. Okay, we understand that. It's actually, we need to build a new, big, large, wider power. Both of the Arabs, both of our potential allies, based upon the contradictions that exist within the system. I will never take away any other rights to exert power in different ways, but have we exhausted all our potential in this sphere? Certainly in the Western sphere, I don't think we have yet. And we need to be much more organized. This debate actually shows that we are unorganized, okay? Not amongst ourselves, but as a people, right? Okay, so the more organized we can, the better we can eventuate our power, actualize our power, and then we can see what best tools we can use to realize.
Yeah. sorry,
Thank
if
you. Amar, quick, please.
yeah, quick one. So I think Palestinians have to learn from the Irish resistance. So even if there is a Belfast or the Good Friday Agreement, there is still people in Ireland who believe in the United Ireland, the sea to the sea. What I'm saying now, even if the international law is not in our side, even if the PLO leaders are not in our side, even if we are not united, if we believe this is our land, because for me the two-state solution is illegal, because my grandma's house is in Jaffa, and my grandma have the right to return to her house in there. Anyway, what I'm saying, even if now Ireland is divided, but if you open the Irish passport, you will see the full village, including the Northern Ireland, including the Belfast, in the Irish Republic of Ireland passport. What I'm saying, we need to believe in our right, and we will achieve it, even if the international law not with us. Even if the PLO leaders are corrupted, we don't care about them. We believe in Palestine, Palestine in our heart. We will return.
Ahsant, Amar. Thank you very much. Forgiveness, we're going to have to end it here, although this has been probably the most interesting Q&A in a very long time from all of the Palestinian Return Center events that I have hosted. So thank you so much once again, Tawfiq, Nardine, Professor Kamil, and Omar. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on here. I will try and ask if we can get a part 2, just to continue this discussion, because I think it's very important. Thank you so much once again to all our viewers and to everyone watching. I'm sure you've learned something today. And peace, love, and solidarity. Please continue on with the struggle. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks, everybody.